I don't mean completely wrong, far from it. But I think they are basically wrong, and tonight's debate is about the problems of atheism. What sort of argument are we engaging in? Well, it's not, I think, a knockdown argument. It is notoriously hard to disprove God's existence in principle, and as the atheistic London bus deliciously said, there is probably no God. Only the Brits would speak like that. There is probably no God. Or as the coffee shop said, the best coffee shop in Oxford, probably. This is the sort of argument where people look at the same person, say, and read her very differently. They both use evidence and reason. Don't be misled. But the results aren't the same, and the quality of the insight is not the same. My problem with many contemporary atheists is that they seem to me like flat earthers. They look at our world, its origin, its nature, its character, its history, and they declare that it can be explained on fairly simple materialistic principles. They are simplistic. They turn a world charged with grandeur into grey on grey. They forget that William of Ockham and even Galileo are actually ours, not theirs. They fail to give an adequate account of reality. How can something come from nothing? How does personal arise from the impersonal? Where does the moral law come from? What is love? What is the good life? What do we make of the constant, almost universal, religious experience of humankind? What are the limits of science? Now, I know that atheists have answers to all these questions. They are serious thinkers. But the answers, it seems to me, are commonly stressed out in trying to avoid the obvious answer. Under atheism, life can have a sort of interim value, an interim meaning, but not an ultimate one. In final terms, meaning cannot be generated, evil cannot be defined, and suffering can only be endured. They use how questions to answer who questions and why questions, and it does not work. Thus, it is not with evolution as science that I have a problem. It is with evolution as an idolatrous explanation of all things. Many times I've seen opinion pieces in a certain journal I won't name confuse mechanism with agency, science with theology. Now, how do atheists respond? I would say it's no good for them to say, you believe because you need a father, pat on the head. I could equally say, you don't believe because you're frightened. There is a father. Motives are not reasons. It's not an argument to point out all the awful things that Christians have done. Christians can point out all the awful things that atheists have done. More, on this point, Christianity is at least self-correcting. It offers objective means by which to identify and judge the evil that religious and other people do. In fact, the Christian doctrine of original sin means that we expect humans to do evil, even those who do it in the name of religion. And it is the Bible itself which recites and condemns the long litany of sins and failures, yes, even murders done by its saints, by the godly, including the sin of crucifying God. Christianity actually critiques itself. It critiques religion. Ultimately, however, I believe that atheists have misread the chief, what I would call the chief demonstrative reason. The demonstration of God is a revelation. I contend that God has entered his own world and invited us to trust him. We may perhaps be able to climb the philosophical ladder towards God. I don't mind. But fundamentally, we believe in God because he believes in us, because he has communicated with us, because he has entered the world as one of us. He is a God for empiricists. Now, of course, I'm talking about Jesus Christ. How do you assess him in accordance with his own reality? taking the record of history, you can assess his life. His close colleagues declared that he was truly man and worshipped him as truly God. You can assess his words. His words are so sharp that they have helped create our language and hundreds of other languages. They shape lives everywhere to this day. You can assess his deeds. They famously exhibit a power and compassion which has inspired countless acts of care and justice over the years. You can assess his death. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the most famous and oft-remembered event in history, and it yields meaning and human value. You can assess his resurrection and ask whether it is likely that his bones still remain in Palestine. But I believe the key way to assess him is in the context of his own people, the Jews, their writings and their history. The God I believe in approaches us with his words via a nation which he has created and a history which he has unfolded. And if you wish to deny him, you need to do so by the refutation of that history and those words and that life. It is not an easy thing to do. And it would be good, let me say, to avoid that anti-Semitism which is so marked a feature of many ignorant references to the Jewish scriptures. How do you explain the Jews if the Jewish God is so awful? Now, some see evil and suffering as an argument against such a God, but I see evil and suffering as an argument for him. This God has done something about it. My God entered the world and himself suffered outrageous evil. In particular, he gave his life in a way which has given in its turn value and meaning and purpose. Especially, he let loose one of the most extraordinary and powerful things that you could possibly imagine, namely forgiveness as a transforming power in human lives. I want to say that Jesus Christ is the demonstration, his self-revelation, his living conversation with the human race. And when atheists refuse to study Jesus seriously, they are flat-earthing. Is Jesus the revelation of God? If you're serious about the God question, you have to meet him where he may be found, where he reveals himself. There is a God in this world. Millions worship him. The question is he worthy of our worship? I wouldn't want to worship him if he weren't. Atheists are not merely against God, but they need to be against this God. Well, the London bus says there's probably no God. The result is a world gone grey with the absence of God. The good news for atheistically minded people like me is this: you're almost right. Move forward. Trust in the one true God who speaks to you and enjoy your life. Why? Because when you do, you will find that the world is charged with the grandeur of God himself.
I've been listening fairly carefully to the Archbishop's homily, and as opening speaker, I want to tease apart two issues which he ran together and in my mind remained a confusion. There are two issues that he discussed and that are held against atheists. One of them is that we deny the existence of gods. The other is that most of us are critical of religions. I use the plural, gods, because, of course, the Abrahamic religions are not the only ones on the board. There are a great many gods that are worshipped. I use the word religions because there are a great many different religions. I want to say something about each of these. To be an atheist, you have to deny the existence of gods, but you don't necessarily have to hold an acerbic view of religions. There are atheists who take a fairly kindly view of religions. Napoleon said that religion stopped the poor from murdering the rich. I think that the religion issue is much more important than the God issue. I'll say something about both. Arguments about whether gods exist are quite disconnected from the fact that many people believe that gods exist. Few people know or bother about the arguments. People embrace religions for various reasons. Because, for example, they satisfy powerful needs for community, identity, and social compliance. Because living in the sight of a caring, omnipotent being, the way they lived in childhood, remains for many people an indispensable need. Excepting the philosophers and religious professionals, theology usually has little to do with religious commitment. But how religions develop, what sustains them, and the directions which they drive the world are issues of immense significance. For millennia, as my colleagues will show, most religions have opposed important lines of moral progress, oppressed women and children, persecuted science. I don't wish to suggest that there have not been progressive lines as well. I believe that religion has done much good, but it has also committed much evil. In contemporary affairs, the influence of ultra-Orthodox Judaism in Israel and the know-nothing Christian nationalism that grips the Republican Party in the United States present perils to the world probably as great as Islamist violence. Locally, in our little pond, conservative politics is dominated by know-nothing, pugilistic, right-wing Christians who have allied with unreason and the ignorant, blind to the plight of the planet. In each case, religious belief is intricately connected with political assurance, for their belief veils from these political actors the depth of their ignorance. They truly believe God is on their side, and they may lead us to ruin. Religion is not necessarily and always pernicious, but it often is. Atheists are not wrong about that. And now I want to say something about the God's question briefly. When it is claimed that some entity exists, a god or a cancer-causing virus or the Golden Mountain, the onus is on the claimant to provide evidence or arguments for the entity's existence. That's a basic postulate without which we could not reason. After more than 2,500 years of theological reflection, at least in the West and probably longer in the East, we do not have a single sound argument or a persuasive piece of evidence for the existence of gods. Now, of course, you may disagree with that. You may think that some arguments are valid. We don't have the time to discuss that here, but I'm just putting forward a position. If you accept that we don't have those valid arguments or evidence, there's only one direction in which you can go. And we don't have any sound arguments, partly because, in the case of the Abrahamic religions, we don't even have coherent conceptions of divinity to argue about. The Olympian gods of the ancient Greeks, or the Adalo, the spirit ancestors of the Kwayo people of Africa, are reasonably coherent. They are human-like beings, powerful but limited, living in some remote or vaguely defined place. We can make some sense of them. They are in much better shape from the perspective of intelligibility than the omnipotent, omniscient and omnibenevolent God of Christianity. Each of these features, or perfections as they're referred to, is hugely problematic. Combining them generates the most incoherent and mysterious entity ever posited by humankind, and the most hopeless quandaries, such as the so-called problem of evil, which my colleagues will elaborate. Of course, some people like the idea of mystery, of leaping like Kierkegaard into the absurd, of ungrounded faith. But then a consequence of this attitude to God, a being about which we know less than about anything, is that invoking it explains nothing. To explain unknowns in cosmology, morality, whatever, in terms of God, is to try to explain mystery by still greater mystery, which is, of course, no explanation at all. I have one final argument, which I think is relevant to some of the things that the Archbishop has said. There are hundreds of extant, mostly incompatible theologies and religions. Theists tend to overlook their differences, but even in the Abrahamic family, they are unmanageable. No reasonably orthodox Jew, for example, could accept that Jesus was the Messiah, let alone his divinity. And of course, the differences with Asian, African and Melanesian religions are really unbridgeable, though religious colonialism has generated many unstable hybrids and comic pastiches. From the point of view of credibility, all of these religions are on the same level. Their epistemological basis is the same. They are incompatible. Given that they are incompatible and on the same level, there's only one option: to ditch all the religions. And there we arrive at atheism. We think atheism is indubitable. There are no good grounds for doubting it. But we don't think that it's incorrigible. Something could turn up. Atheism is an aspect of rigorous empiricism, a deep respect for evidence and argument. And as such, atheists remain open to the possibility that we could be wrong. Can any of our religious opponents concede that they could be wrong?
With the new atheists, the debate about God has become a debate about what it means to be human. And I believe that the atheists are wrong because their accounts of love and of reason, of human rationality, are so emaciated it's impossible to defend human dignity by any reference to them. Let's consider what Richard Dawkins says about love. He defines it as a kind of irrationality mechanism built into the brain, conferring advantage in mating and rearing the young. Human beings, he argues, are survival machines. We are robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. He says we exist for the benefit of our DNA rather than the other way around. Human life, he says, is just bytes and bytes and bytes of digital information. We are built as gene machines and we are cultured as meme machines. Thus, the atheist human being is a creature of fate. Her deepest personal relationships are explained by an irrationality mechanism in the brain. It was, however, one of the achievements of Christianity to liberate people from the fear of fate by offering them a revolutionary new concept of the person as a creature with a free will and a rational intellect. Christians built a whole new civilization on their belief in the power of the gospel to transform the human will from an engine of selfish cruelty into a vessel of divine grace, capable of love of one's neighbour. The love of neighbour principle fostered the care of widows and orphans, and unwanted babies, including many female babies who were less popular, who were left to die of exposure on hillsides. Even Wikipedia acknowledges that the hospital was an invention driven by Christian mercy and Byzantine innovation. By the medieval period, the Benedictine monks and the Hospitaller Order of St. John ran some 2,000 hospitals across Europe. At the same time, the Franciscans and the Dominicans built universities because they believed that there is a symbiotic relationship between faith and reason. Faith without reason can end in fundamentalism, and I think any Christian with a Year 10 education would acknowledge that and would deplore it. But reason without faith is narrowly instrumental. It can't tell us anything about values. The greatest of all the European universities, such as Oxford, Cambridge, St Andrews, Edinburgh, the Sorbonne, the Charles University in Prague, and the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, were all Christian foundations. In the 18th century, however, the intellectual fashion was to separate faith and reason and to privatise faith. Philosophers began to speak of pure reason, uncontaminated by religious myths. Then in the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche declared that this notion of pure reason was itself a myth, and indeed that all we have are myths, and he preferred the Greek myths to the Christian ones because he hated Christian morality. Given the version of Christian morality that Friedrich Nietzsche received from his two maiden aunts, I can well understand his reaction. But in his enthusiasm to destroy all Christian values, he threw out the rational intellect and the free will of Christian anthropology. He concluded that human beings are no more than a bundle of drives and urges, and he rejoiced in the return of the pre-Christian idea of fate. The neo-Nietzscheans and their fellow atheists have not only gone to war against God in their fight for limitless freedom, but they have evacuated the human person of any self who might enjoy that freedom. Sexual relations hollowed out into their materialist shell become mutual manipulation. Political relations hollowed out into their materialist shell become brutal power. And market relations hollowed out into their material shell give us consumerism and status anxiety. If our cultural horizons are determined by our behaviour as meme machines, as Dawkins argues, then it is no wonder that we have ended up with the cult of the celebrity and that people pay a fortune for a pair of Dolce & Gabbana underpants because they have seen a poster of David Beckham wearing them. But I think that even Nietzsche would have found this idea of human life tragic. This is the sad condition of the homeless ego. For the Christian, however, life is not an episode of a reality TV survival contest. It's more of an epic in which the quest is to obtain real freedom linked to real love and real goodness. Now, atheists will tell you that the quest is futile and it's a symptom of a retreat from rationality in order to satisfy infantile desires, and that people who are into this sort of thing cause wars. There are two things I would like to make about this. The first is that in the Encyclopedia of Wars by Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod, some 1,763 wars are documented, of which 123 have been classified to include religious elements. This amounts to less than 7% of all wars. My second point is that the standard atheist solution to the fear of tribalism is to expand the powers of the state. The state becomes our new saviour by fostering secularism. This may seem like a good idea at first, but then it is an historical fact that for the last couple of 100 years, every serious attempt to do this has gone terribly wrong. The secularist states have been the most prolifically homicidal in human history. The secularists always end up erecting rival sacred calendars and rival political liturgies. The political becomes a parody of the theological. For those who worry about tribalism, I would recommend the Belgian film Joyeux Noël. It is set in the trenches of the Somme, in the midst of a war caused by nationalism, which was a return to the idolatry of the state and the idolatry of the tribe. And there was a moment on Christmas Eve when young men left their trenches, exchanged gifts of cigarettes and alcohol, and then their chaplains celebrated midnight mass. The movie shows that Christian universalism is the one thing that can transcend tribalism in the embrace of the universal and the particular. Conversely, the myth of atheistic rationality fails to liberate and incite to love. The principle of the survival of the fittest and its ontology of violence creates a cruel social ethos. In the ideas of the atheist, there has been a sort of anthropological mutation so radical as to endanger the basic elements of human experience. Free will is replaced by the fate of genetic determinism. The intellect is truncated to a device for satisfying desire, and human life itself becomes a product and a commodity. The atheists are wrong because human life, human love and human reason cannot possibly be that meaningless. Thank you.
The prima facie evidence that all gods are man-made is, of course, their treatment of women. The idea that women are fully human is something that man-made religions seem to struggle with. I love the paradise that is offered to Islamic jihad warriors. Apparently, as martyrs for Allah, they will receive their reward in heaven by disporting themselves with innumerable virgins. As one wit put it, imagine all those obedient, God-fearing Muslim women who keep themselves pure behind all-encompassing clothing out of their devout worship of their God, only to find that when they die, their reward for all this virginal vigilance is to end up as whores for terrorists. Response when I heard about this extraordinarily male-centric view of the eternal reward was to wonder what appalling sin those poor virgins must have committed to require such punishment. In other words, the terrorist heaven is clearly the virgin's hell. This fantasy of heaven, by the way, illustrates religion's use of a classic advertising trick, which I am an expert in. They create fear of damnation in everyone, including the powerless, then offer them hope of salvation, but in the case of the powerless, only after they are dead. Religion has been used this way to keep all sorts of people in their place, but in my 9 minutes, I will concentrate on their effect on women. Conveniently for the blokes who invented them, gods of all kinds are entirely happy to see one half of humanity held in subjection to the other half. According to many of their earthly messengers, they have approved of and even commanded that women be beaten, raped, at least in marriage, and sold as property, either to husbands or masters. Gods have stated that a woman's testimony and word is worth less than a man, that she is not to be permitted to speak in public, take part in public life, take headship over a man, preach religion, Peter and Tracy, or in extreme cases, even appear in public. It was religious belief that drove what may be the longest and bloodiest pogrom in recorded human history, the persecution and execution of, in the vast majority of cases, vulnerable women accused of witchcraft across Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries. We never mention that anymore. In theocracies, we still watch gods deny women and girls the right to work, travel, drive, get access to healthcare, or even walk the streets unaccompanied. In 2002, 14 schoolgirls died in a fire in Mecca after being forced back into their burning boarding house by religious police because they were not properly covered. That is outrageous. Women's lives only began to improve in the West when feminism emerged, thanks to the secular Enlightenment. Mary Wollstonecraft, author of Vindication of the Rights of Women, was the one who created this marvellous document, and she couldn't be in greater contrast to that first Mary in any way. She was no virgin. She was a vulnerable and suffering human being, blessed, if you'll excuse the term, with a shining intellect and the clear-eyed courage it took to see through millennia of male hypocrisy. She was despised and vilified in her own time, most often by the religious. In the 300 years since she first put pen to paper, the lives of women and girls, at least in the developed world, have changed unarguably for the better by almost any objective measure. Women in the secular West are better off than they have ever been in terms of longevity, mental, physical, reproductive and emotional health, economic independence and human rights. Today's women leave her female ancestors for dead. Unfortunately, however, representatives of God have resisted women's progress every step of the way. They have variously opposed higher education for women, higher status employment for women, their right to vote, their right to enter Parliament, their right to their own earnings, income and property, their right to their own children after divorce or separation, their right to resist domestic violence, their right to learn about their own bodies, their right to refuse sexual intercourse in marriage or to agree to it outside of marriage, and, of course, their right to contraception, abortion and sexual information. Less than a century ago, if a woman was so badly damaged by successive childbearing that doctors advised against further pregnancy, churches resisted her right to use or even know about contraception, and she had to rely on the goodwill and restraint of her husband to avoid further catastrophic damage or even death. Only last year, a nun was excommunicated for allowing the US hospital she ran to give an abortion to a woman who would have died without it. When chloroform was invented in the 19th century, doctors immediately heralded it as a boon for birthing women. Church leaders condemned it because they believed women's suffering in labour was ordained by God as punishment for Eve's, it's already come up, original sin. Fortunately for labouring women everywhere, the head of the Church of England, surprisingly enough, was herself a birthing mother. Queen Victoria ignored her spiritual advisers while giving birth to her 9 children, grabbed the chloroform with both hands and said, "Sod off." A very good argument for having women in all positions of power, it would seem to me. To be fair, as women have made gains in the secular and developed world, many religious believers and leaders have changed their opinions and been persuaded about the universal benefit of female equality and opportunity. However, it is no coincidence that societies where women enjoy high levels of personal freedom are the richest and most stable in the world. We now understand that when you educate women and girls, the benefits accrue to the entire family rather than simply to the individual. There's even research to indicate that societies with women in more positions of power and influence, men have longer life expectancy. We're awfully nice to you, you know. Unlike the other way around. Can it also be a coincidence that these are the societies that are also amongst the most secular and, apart from the US, are often cited as those where belief in a God is dying most rapidly? It is almost as if God and women's rights are diametrically opposed to one another. As one rises, the other falls. The fact that gods and women appear to be so firmly in opposite corners is yet another indication to me that gods are all about men. It is impossible in 9 minutes to do justice to the fearful price women have paid as a result of man-made religions. I have not time to mention the fearful decimation of women by HIV in Africa, helped along by the wicked and paranoid misinformation about the permeability of condoms promoted by the Catholic Church. Suffice to say that 4 out of 10 girls in Kenya are now HIV positive, many of them God-fearing virgins infected on their wedding night. For me, however, it is not just the gross history of religion's treatment of women that informs my atheism. It is the simple fact of the one-eyed nature of all the world's religions that finally convinces me that all gods are man-made. Yes, even bloody Buddhism, that last refuge of the fashionable Western mystic. Hang on! I've only got a minute. Here's my punchline. After all, why hasn't the Dalai Lama ever been reincarnated as a girl?
There are few things today that are quite as fashionable as atheism. In particular, the vulgar, sensationalist style of the so-called new atheism, decried by so many atheists, lends itself especially well to the spirit of our age and poses little, if any, serious challenge to our most serious moral and social ills. Now, I want you to hear very carefully what I'm saying. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that atheism is the cause of our social ills. I'm not even saying that atheism is the root of all evil. To make such a claim, I think, would be to accord this current brand of chic atheism with a little bit too much importance, a bit too much gravity. In a way, I think where atheism fits in our current cultural moment is a bit simpler than that, a bit sillier than that. Our real problem today is the impoverishment of our moral imaginations, our inability to think properly about such elevated things as good, beauty, truth, law, love, life, death, freedom, humanity, the end or purpose of things, even sex itself, without these ideas being debased by a pointless, listless, all-pervasive nihilism. As Flannery O'Connor put it 55 years ago, even more true today, I feel, if you live today, you breathe in nihilism. In or out of the church, it's the gas that you breathe. And so it's not at all surprising to me that when we can't even think properly about this list of lower order goods, the good, beauty, truth, law, love, freedom, it doesn't surprise me that when we turn to the highest good, what philosophy for most of its history has regarded as the ultimate object of human contemplation, namely God himself, it doesn't surprise me that we find that that's beyond our current imagination. And so many of these so-called proofs of the existence of God that have pervaded the history of philosophy have themselves been a kind of imaginative wrestling, an art, a practice, a discipline of contemplation, of thinking, believing that all thought ought to be caught, if you like, in this upward draft towards the divine. It's also no wonder that when the idea of God is explained by atheists, and unfortunately we've seen some examples this evening, that this God, rather than being the highest good, is just as vulgar and petty and agonistic as their conceptions of gender, politics, and sex. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, my proposal tonight, my argument is that atheism today is but a symptom. A powerful one, but it is a symptom nonetheless. It's a symptom of an all-pervasive nihilism. It's a symptom of the flattening out of all value, the destruction of all capital G good, the decimation of all hierarchy. Now, if we break this all-pervasive nihilism into its constituent parts, into its cultural mechanisms, instead of just throwing around words like nihilism and atheism and secularism as if those words were self-explanatory, which I don't think they are. I think what's at stake here, and the way that this chic, trendy atheism nestles itself in our current cultural mood, I think it begins to become quite clear. So, for instance, what are the characteristics of our culture at the moment? Firstly, I'd say there's the fetishization of health, safety, and pleasure as the new cardinal virtues of our time, in place of where there used to be the great virtues of democracy, equality, fraternity, liberty. In our time, we are confronted with the massive withering of civil society, and along with it, any concept of a common good, so much so we can't even come to basic agreement about how to treat foreigners who come to our land, or how best to care for the environment. We're confronted with an impoverished brutality in public debate. Welcome to Twitter. We're confronted with the patent vulgarities and trivializations that are entrenched in the media. The great Catholic intellectual Hilaire Belloc, some 90 years ago, said that the whole purpose of newspapers is to bamboozle people with an orgy of headlines and full-colored photos so that they no longer have to think. We're confronted with the ubiquity of piss-taking cynicism. The Chaser. Jane Caro. We are confronted with a reduction of ethics to mere mechanism, and the destruction of morality and the elevation of a kind of form of pointless common sense. And finally, we are confronted with the predominance of a demystified, mechanized mode of science. Science now as the last thing that there is to believe in. Now, each of these elements, it seems to me, have conspired to create conditions that are ideal for a particular, historically unique, and particularly promiscuous intellectual conceit, a form of atheism that would have been entirely unrecognizable to the vast majority of history's atheists. And because this form of atheism eschews any kind of hierarchy of values, any sense of common good, it's left with, at best, a fragmented approach to crucial moral questions. So, for instance, this disordered, fragmented approach to ethics suits a culture that can rage against Rupert Murdoch and rail against big multinational corporations, but cannot muster a critique of big porn. That can embrace a kind of intensified reverence for the planet, but finds it unobjectionable to snuff out unborn life. I'll confess that I'm less concerned with atheism at the moment, whether atheists feel that rush of wonder or awe when confronted with a newly disenchanted world. I'm more worried about the inability to experience wonder, even beauty, in the face of a child with a profound disability, and to see that child as the very presence of God who humbled himself and became human. Ladies and gentlemen, my final point is that we may well be unwilling, and I certainly am, to claim that one cannot be good without God, but there is one thing for damn sure. Without God, there is no good. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was very pleased when Dr. Jensen began by saying that he is sceptical about all gods except one. What I wanted to say to him, will say to him now, is, Dr. Jensen, congratulations. You are getting there. You just need to join us on the negative side of this debate and go that one God further. Now, ladies and gentlemen, much of what we've heard tonight from our friends on the affirmative side has really been telling us, look, you do not understand, the world does not yet understand what it owes to religion. What I say back to them is this: yes, we do not yet understand the entirety of what we know to religion, but we're beginning to suspect. Ladies and gentlemen, religion is something that is man-made. It is not something that is God-established or God-guided. My second speaker rubbed in that point. Religion, and specifically Christianity, because all of my opponents here come from the Christian tradition. Christianity has a long record of persecution, of anti-intellectualism, of cruelty and indeed of misogyny. It has all the hallmarks not only of being a human construction but of being specifically man-made. Now, you might say, all right, you look at the record of Christianity, we don't appreciate the good things. There are good things, there are also bad things. There are bad things from secular thinkers as well, sure. But secular organisations, secular schools of thought do not claim to be the product and to be guided by an all-powerful, all-good God of love. What, ladies and gentlemen, would be the hallmark of an organisation which is guided by an all-powerful, all-good God of love? Think back over the record of any of the churches represented here tonight and think, does any of those churches have the hallmarks of that kind of establishment and guidance? I suggest to you, no. Going back to as early as the 4th century, we see Christianity, as soon as it gains power in the Roman Empire, becoming a persecutorial religion, imposing itself on everybody else. And although it may not be the sole cause of wars, it makes wars worse throughout human history. And that is why in the 17th century people started saying, we have had enough. From now on, religion must be separated from the state. And that's a critical point, ladies and gentlemen. Religion must be separated from the state. Now, one thing that struck me about the speakers on the other side was a lack of faith. There are certain traditional arguments for the existence of God. They have no faith in those arguments. They did not develop even one of those arguments in any detail whatsoever. What they did, and you heard, they came here and they moralised at us. They told us how bad our society is without God, right? That's really the substance of what we heard tonight. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there are major moral issues in this world today. There are major problems that face us. The problem of global poverty, the problem of climate change and the resistance to doing anything about climate change, the problem about the callous, xenophobic treatment of refugees in this country, and we can go on and on. And atheists have nothing to do with any of those problems. The moral malaise, to the extent that there is one today, is nothing to do with atheism. And when it comes to the moral record of the churches, we see hundreds of years of the churches making wars worse, engaging in mutual persecution, engaging in denigration and repression of perfectly healthy, normal forms of sexuality. And when we see the churches confronted today, as the Catholic Church certainly has been, with unhealthy forms of sexuality in the form of the abuse of children, how do they respond to unhealthy sexuality? They respond with moral obtuseness, with blame shifting, with downplaying, with spin doctoring, with mismanagement, and certainly none of the hallmarks of being an organisation which has been founded and guided by an all-good, all-powerful God of love. The churches do not look like organisations founded by an all-good, all-powerful God of love, and the world that we live in, wonderful though it may be in many ways, also does not look like a world created by an all-powerful, all-good God of love. Why do we see so much of so many kinds of excruciating pain, suffering, misery in this world if it's a world in the charge of an all-good, all-powerful God of love? Why did life, as we know it, including us, arise by the cruel, brutal process of evolution which churns over species, which inflicts endless misery on sentient creatures? Why would an all-powerful, all-good God of love set up that process? That is not a process which is consistent with the existence of an all-powerful, all-good God of love. Such a God could have brought things into existence straight away with no problems. This God we're talking about can do anything. We're talking about an omnipotent God, and a God who certainly knows how to do whatever needs to be done, ladies and gentlemen. Or so they tell us. This is supposed to be an all-good, all-powerful God of love, right? Ladies and gentlemen, they sometimes, when I say they, I guess I mean Christian apologists, talk about free will as an answer to that question. Well, free will is a difficult concept, but if it means anything, it means being able to act in terms of your own values and your own nature. It's so that God has free will. God has free will, but God will always, we're told, act benevolently because it's in God's nature to do so. Well, if that's the case, if God can freely always act to do the good because God has a benevolent nature, why did God not create all the rest of us with the same benevolent nature so that we also freely, of our own nature, act to do the good? That's what it's supposed to be like in heaven. Let me just finish with a little bit about the burden of proof in tonight's debate. Some of you may have come along tonight not thinking of yourselves as atheists, but you're with me because you go that one God further and you don't actually believe in a God, but you don't call yourself an atheist, right? Now, maybe that's because you think atheism does not really kind of reflect your full values or your full philosophy of life. You may think of yourself as a humanist or a rationalist or a skeptic or something like that. You don't want to call yourself an atheist. But let me say to you that unless an argument has actually been put to demonstrate that there is a God, and no such argument has been put, unless such an argument has been put, you cannot, in good conscience, support this motion that atheists are wrong, even if you want to go one bit of philosophy further and call yourself a humanist or something. All right? Even if you want to go that one bit of philosophy further and call yourself a humanist or a rationalist or something else, you cannot say, in good conscience, that atheists are wrong about the central question. The central question, can it be demonstrated that any gods exist? Ladies and gentlemen, that simply has not been demonstrated tonight. Not one argument has been put in any concerted way to deal with that. And in fact, it seems that our friends on the other side have lost all faith in those traditional arguments. Thank you very much.
Philosopher Russell Blackford wrapping up the case for the negative in the IQ squared debate, atheists are wrong. And his arguments helped convince many of the pre-debate undecided to side with the godless, with the audience vote at the end of the night 66% to 28%. That's it for today's Big Ideas, but don't forget you can watch an extensive back catalogue of all the best IQ squareds and much more besides at our fabulous New Look website. And if you want to know what's on when and where, follow us on Twitter. I'm Waleed Ali. See you next time.